Ali Aslan with General Petraeus. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nick, for this kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen. And you are in for a treat within the next 30 minutes because we are going to do a tour de horizon, if you will, of all the major hotspots and conflicts that are plaguing the world right now. And I couldn't ask for a more competent, more knowledgeable speaker to take me on this tour with him, of course. Retired General David Petraeus is chairman of the KKR Global Institute, a leading global investment firm based in New York. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the US military, during which he commanded coalition forces in Iraq and US and NATO forces in Afghanistan, of course. Following his service in the military, General Petraeus served as the director of the CIA, and I couldn't be more delighted to have him, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome David Petraeus.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
General, wonderful to have you here. I know, before we get started on the many issues and topics that are dominating the headlines, I know that you have fairly close ties to Poland. Poland as a country means a lot to you. Tell me why.
Well, it does. It's very, very special. I was actually here in Warsaw on the day that Poland entered NATO. I watched and experienced personally as Poland demonstrated that it was one of NATO's most important members. Obviously, I served as the commander of a coalition that included Polish forces in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. I was with Polish forces in Bosnia on the day the 9/11 attacks occurred. I actually saw the second plane fly into the second tower on a TV in a Polish headquarters, Nordpol Brigade headquarters, realizing that the world had significantly changed. And over the next decade, I was deployed on operations, again, together with Polish forces, with coalitions, for well over 6 of those 10 years. I was here in Warsaw 2 days before the very tragic crash at Smolensk that took President Kaczynski, who had just decorated me with a Polish decoration. Again, 2 days prior to that, General Gongar, who was my escort for that and a friend. And by the way, I met with his wife yesterday to convey personal condolences in addition to the ones that my wife and I sent by letter. General Book on that plane as well, another comrade from Iraq. So indeed, this is a very, very deep affection, and it is founded on long experience together. And again, we were always able to count on Polish forces, Polish soldiers, and indeed Poland as a state and coalition partner in these different endeavors that I was privileged to be part of.
So your personal and professional ties with Poland run deep, and it's very clear that how appreciative you are of being back here in Warsaw, General. Actually, in the very spot that you're sitting there, exactly almost to the day a year ago, retired U.S. General Ben Hodges sat across from me here at the Warsaw Security Forum, and he said about the intensifying rivalry between the U.S. and China that it's very likely that in the next 15 years, the U.S. will be at war with China. I'm sure you have seen that headline from the Warsaw Security come out. Would you concur? Would you agree with Ben Hodges?
Well, look, I love Ben Hodges. Ben Hodges was actually one of the brigade commanders in the Great 101st Airborne Division when we did the fight to Baghdad. I decorated him with the Bronze Star Medal for Valor. We served together subsequently, another tour in Iraq, and then also in Afghanistan. I think very, very highly of him. He has a great way with words. I have always loved that he has said, when it comes to looking at what the United States really sees as important, don't just read the tweets, follow the money, follow the troops, and follow the policy. And by the way, if you do that, you will see that actually NATO is stronger now than arguably it ever has been since the end of the Cold War. And indeed, the U.S. contributions and policies and so forth actually have continued very much on the trajectory, perhaps even deepening the trajectory that we were on under the previous administration. That said, I don't know that I would say quite so categorically that the U.S. and China would be at war in the next 10 or 15 years. In fact, that is a very concerning prospect. That does not mean that there is not a very significant and developing geostrategic rivalry between the United States and China. It doesn't mean that we are not already in the early stages of what might be termed a technology Cold War, because I think that we are. But look, I want to see this relationship. It is the most important relationship, not just for our two countries, the US and China, but for the entire world. This relationship will determine a great deal, literally, of how the world is organized, whether the rules-based international order continues to retain its importance or is pulled apart by contending forces, whether or not the technology Cold War continues even further, and you end up with real cleavages, not just the fact that the World Wide Web is not worldwide anymore because the Great Firewall of China keeps 1.3 billion people from accessing it, but much more beyond that, where supply chains are not mutual anymore. My hope is that we can get past the trade difficulties right now, which do reflect, I think, legitimate concerns. I think the issue between our two countries is to understand the interests of each, have very deep strategic dialogue, to then accommodate each country. China, the rising power of the world, which has achieved in 40 years economic growth that no country has ever remotely achieved, not a large country at the very least. Some over 40 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China, and to see what has been accomplished. And I should note that the financial firm, the global firm in which I am a partner, is the biggest investor of our type in China. We very much want to continue that, deepen it, and see that grow further. But for that to happen, there's going to have to be some concord, there's going to have to be some agreement, there's going to have to be, frankly, respect that there are concerns that I believe are legitimate on the US side, that are not just unique to this president, this Republican Party, or it's the entire country that has grown concerned over some practices that are unfair in various respects, and that do have very significant security implications. My hope, again, is that we can resolve those. My hope certainly is that we would not come to blows. But to ensure that that doesn't happen, I very strongly support the idea of being firm but not provocative, of continuing to follow through with the rebalance to Asia as the previous administration wisely crafted it. It's not a pivot away from Europe or the Middle East. It's an emphasis of more assets there. And frankly, if you're spending $740 billion on defense as the US is, which is more than twice as much as all of our other NATO allies put together, it's more than China and the next 10 or 12 countries put together, we will be able to do that. And that is indeed the intent, but not an intent to come to a clash of arms. And again, I hope that this is one of the cases where Ben Hodges' quip turned out to be a little bit ahead of reality.
Certainly his remarks that China and the US will be at war very likely within the next 15 years was one of the dominating headlines that came from the Warsaw Security Forum 2018, clearly an assessment that you don't necessarily subscribe to. You mentioned NATO, and there that we as Europeans should particularly focus on the deeds and not tweets on the part of the US president. You've said that Vladimir Putin is the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War.
I believe that's true. I mean, there is nothing as important to alliance as a shared threat. And Vladimir Putin has indeed, once again, provided a shared threat to the alliance. This time, obviously not from Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but rather from Russia. We do have, I think, as the national security strategy of the United States rightly recognizes, a resurgence of great power rivalries. That is not just, of course, with Russia, it's also certainly with China, which is, again, even more important. But the threat that Russia has posed, I mean, just ask the Georgians, ask the Ukrainians, ask the Estonians, the most connected government in the world, that was shut down by a distributed denial of service attack, massive by Russia. Ask all of the other countries. Ask Moldova, which still has 1,500 Russian paratroopers on its soil in a, quote, peacekeeping operation. And another wonderful quote from the quotable Ben Hodges was to note that peacekeeping in Russia means that we come in, we take a piece, and we keep it. And thank you for that, Ben.
Well, there you go. But you do see because we will be talking about the future of NATO later on during the afternoon. You do see that the state of NATO is strong.
NATO has a new reason for living. And I think now there are other factors that have also helped greatly coming out of the Euro recession, if you will, the Great Recession is another major factor. But certainly the threat that is posed by Vladimir Putin has had a unifying force that is unequaled again in the wake of the Cold War. Let's remember, in the early part of this century, NATO was literally in search of a mission. Remember the out of area missions that it was considering. I mean, that's why it just was looking for something to retain relevance. Well, it certainly is relevant, again, if you're in Poland, the Baltic states, or really any of the other European nations. Because, of course, it's not just this geographic threat. Now Russia has posed a very significant threat in the new domain of warfare, which is, of course, cyberspace. So we not only now have air, land, sea, we also have cyberspace, which is a domain in which warfare is ongoing on a daily basis. And we obviously have outer space as well, which is another area that NATO and all countries, I think, are going to have to look to also.
We talked about China, we talked about Russia. Let's talk about Iran for a second. Now, you have called the recent attack on Saudi energy infrastructure a significant escalation on the part of Iran. We talked about whether China and the US are drifting towards war. What about Iran and the US?
Well, there certainly is a greater risk. I think there is no question. I think that literally is indisputable. I think that the maximum pressure campaign has literally put Iran into a box, into a corner, where it felt it almost had to lash out. It waited a year as these sanctions bit. They're in a very difficult position. Their growth is plummeting. They're very much in a recession that is growing. The currency is depreciating and inflation is skyrocketing, and all of the other attendant challenges for their citizens. And keep in mind that the regime sees this, obviously, as very threatening to their very existence. So at some point, there is going to have to be a return to the negotiating table. There are reports out now that this was very nearly the case at the UN General Assembly. I know you were there. There were 4 points of agreement that were brokered by President Macron between President Rouhani and President Trump. In the end, I think perhaps the security state in Iran pulled the plug on that. By the way, this is something we should remember. There are actually 2 states in Iran. There is the visible state. This is an elected president, albeit from a slate of candidates who are approved to run. There is a parliament, there are ministers, there's an Army, Navy, Air Force, all the rest of that. But then there's the deep state, and that is the Revolutionary Guards Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. It's the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force. They're a cross between Special Ops and CIA, if you will. There's the besieged militia, millions of pipe swingers who can clear the streets if there are demonstrations. And that has an increased role, not just in the councils of power with the supreme leader, but also in the economy of Iran. Some estimate as much as 40% or more controlled by entities that they personally control. So that is a reality with which we have to deal. I'm not one, by the way, who thinks that the regime is going to be toppled anytime soon because they have such a strong mechanism. There could well be additional unrest, as we saw a year or so ago. But at the end of the day, we have to sit down. They are right now, what they're doing is feeling the edges of the U.S. in particular. What can they get away with? And they've tried what have been a series of somewhat ambiguous. We know that Iran is behind them, but sometimes they're being carried out by proxy forces from in Yemen, the Houthis, or militias elsewhere, this kind of thing. They're going to continue to do that after a pause. I suspect they'll do it again. So again, the sooner that we can get back to the table, I think.
But the irony, of course, General, is people said we had already sat down with them at a table. We had hashed out a deal. Many Europeans are saying President Trump needlessly dismembered a functioning deal, the Iran nuclear agreement.
Well, I think that is at least an arguable position. Frankly, people constantly ask me, what would I be doing if I were still the CIA director or U.S. Central Command, which is responsible for the Middle East and central part of South Asia, one of the questions I'd be asking is precisely what are our policy objectives relative to the nuclear program? What specifically do we want above and beyond the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the nuclear agreement? What is it? Is it the sunset clauses? Which one concerns us? If so, how do we extend that? And indeed, one of the points of agreement between President Rouhani and President Trump, apparently, again, brokered by President Macron, had to do with negotiating, again, it sounds like an extension of these sunset clauses. And then specifically, what is it that we want to achieve relative to the two other major areas of concern, the support for very damaging and destructive militia activity in a variety of countries, which they would like to Lebanonize. In Iraq, they'd love to do this. In other words, where you have not only a very powerful militia on the ground, like Lebanese Hezbollah, but you also have power in the parliament as well. And then what is it that we want to achieve relative to their missile program, which we have seen has a greater degree of accuracy than I think was assessed prior to those attacks.
So about the dangerous potential that you see there, explosive potential that you are observing. You have, of course, commanded U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. It seems that the U.S. President Donald Trump wants to remove all U.S. troops before the 2020 election as part of a deal that he can present to the American people. Of course, he canceled a meeting with Taliban leaders at Camp David. As someone who knows Afghanistan probably like no other, what do you think about removing all U.S. troops from the region?
Well, look, first of all, nobody wants to see troops go home more than the commander who was privileged to command them at the height of our involvement. We had 150,000 troops when I was privileged to be the commander of ISAF. And I know intimately the cost in blood and treasure. And no one wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than I did between Iraq and Afghanistan. So again, I fervently hope that we could go home. Having said that, we went to Afghanistan for a reason. That's because the sanctuary in which al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks and conducted the initial training of the attackers was on eastern Afghanistan soil. When the Taliban controlled that country, we went in to eliminate that sanctuary. We did. We have stayed to ensure they cannot reestablish it, something they have continued to try to do, and now the Islamic State wants to do as well. I have very serious reservations about the Taliban honoring an agreement that would not allow them to do that again, especially as they've just recently been caught colluding in some other locations, a training camp that was jointly manned by Taliban and al-Qaeda. So again, I had real concerns. I published those. I ultimately did have the resort of a retired four-star general that when all else fails is write an op-ed piece, and so I did. And then to follow up to ensure that the message was transmitted, I went on Fox News, something that I don't always do. But no, I'm not claiming, I mean many people, Senator Lindsey Graham and I both, we all shared these kinds of concerns. General Jack Keane, another big mentor and longtime friend of mine, also, again, a number of individuals. And we try to do this non-politically. I am not one who, I don't vote, I'm not with a party, I don't support candidates, contributed, I give advice to either party, and what I try to offer is truly in a non-partisan fashion. And in this case, I felt very strongly that the agreement as it was understood at the time publicly had some areas of significant concern, and I actually applauded the fact that the president recognized that and decided not to continue down that road. It's, I think, very unlikely that the Taliban could deliver that. By the way, let's keep in mind also, the Taliban can't even get all of the Taliban to lay down their weapons. In fact, some, just because of the discussions that have been held, have already defected to al-Qaeda and to the Islamic State. They don't control the Haqqani network. They don't control the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. They don't control al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, or the Tariqi Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, among others. And there are even some additional ones that are smaller. So I think it's very, very unlikely. Beyond that, I don't think that an organization like the Taliban is truly going to negotiate in good faith if they don't think that we are committed to staying. So my argument has been that we should have a strategy for staying rather than a strategy for going, that the commitment should be a sustained commitment, which I think is necessary, by the way, wherever we are confronting Islamist extremists, but it should always be one that is sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure for the U.S., the coalition, the host nation, and it should be one that is offered in terms of training, equipping, advising, assisting, and enabling, but not doing. And we've been able to do this in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, another area where Poland has stepped up, of course, to defeat the Islamic State Caliphate. By the way, we need to stay there as well, and I have voiced concerns over the plans at one point in time, indications that we might withdraw from Syria, because there is still an incipient insurgency there of Islamist extremists, and there's still other important interests to make sure Iran can't have a ground line of communication from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and down into southern Lebanon to Hezbollah.
But it's clear, you don't think that removing all U.S. troops from Afghanistan is a good idea. Now,
Well, unless, again, you can get an agreement, which I would not think is possible, but if you can get that and it's verifiable and there are snapback and there are provisions for what happens if they don't honor the agreement, and you can maintain the regional platform for counterterrorism, which is also another reason. I mean, it's well known that the operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in Pakistan was launched from Afghan soil. In fact, it was when I was the commander there.
Right. Let's talk about this continent here for a second. I know you were in London last week, and of course, Brexit is all time and energy consuming topic in this particular continent for sure. What's your assessment of Brexit, and what does it mean for the UK?
Hard to say. I mean, there's a British citizen here who said from hour to hour he doesn't know what the situation is. I mean, clearly there is
what's the sense
again
you got
a degree
when you were
of
there?
turbulence. Well, look, I've been asked for a one-word description of in London, by the way, on air, my view of Brexit, and I thought of this wonderful British word that is called barking, as in a dog barking. It's madness. I mean, it's craziness. There is some of that elsewhere in the world, to be sure, as well. There is, as others have mentioned, there is a degree of populism in many of our democracies that is concerning, although I think on the end of the day, democracy always self-corrects. It does ultimately come back to rationality. I think once this is through, whatever way it turns out, that the U.S. will still feel very much a special relationship with those in the UK. They have always been, I mean, I had 7 UK deputies in the 3 different NATO commands that I had as a 3- and a 4-star general. And that relationship, I think, very much persists. I was literally on stage on Sunday at a literary festival of all places, being interviewed with General Sir Nick Carter, who's the Chief of Defense Staff, and was a division commander. In fact, by the way, the great Ben Hodges was, I think, his deputy at that time in Kandahar, when he commanded more U.S. forces than any other U.S. division commander at that time in the world, and more U.S. forces than any British commander, I think, in post-World War II history. That relationship will still be strong. The UK is still going to be the number 5 or number 6 economy in the world. It is still going to have a diplomatic intelligence, development, and military influence way beyond the size of its domestic population.
Time runs fast when you are exchanging conversation, when you're exchanging words with someone as knowledgeable as you. Unfortunately, we're slowly running out of time, but we've talked about Iran, Afghanistan, Brexit, China, and Russia, of course. For the remainder of the time, let's look at Washington, D.C. Interestingly enough, every week seems to bring another story of partisanship and dysfunctionality in Washington. Of course, the latest news is for the call on the part of the Democratic Party to impeach Donald Trump over his call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. By the way, to my American friends, it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine. That is just another issue. How do you think this is going to play out? Do you think Donald Trump is going...
By the way, I was just in Ukraine as well 2 months ago, and after that, it was after the election of President Zelensky, but before the parliamentary election. That subsequent election has strengthened his hand. I am actually quite hopeful about Ukraine, not the Ukraine, and I do believe that the populace there has elected reform. They have chosen change, and they are quite optimistic about anti-corruption, de-oligarchization, land reform, banking reform, government reform, all of this, I think, is relatively quite hopeful. We do need to continue to support Ukraine. I wrote that again afterwards with Ambassador John Herbst, our former ambassador there, having gone to the front lines and having seen that what is described as a frozen conflict may be frozen in the sense that the lines are static, the front lines, which is like World War I might add. It is very much all underground. You put your head above the parapet there on those front lines and it's going to get shot off. But it is not frozen in terms of the amount of bullets that are flying, especially toward the Ukrainian forces, often with weapons that are prohibited by the agreements that the Russians have been party to. So it is very much a hot war in the sense of the number of Ukrainian casualties. And again, they very much deserve our support and that of other Western European or Western countries that have provided even more support to Ukraine than the US has, and the IMF and the World Bank. And one last point, that they have committed, again, to continue the IMF reforms. Let's keep in mind the real battle for Ukraine is not going to be won or lost in the Donbass, it's going to be won or lost in Kiev, in the capital. And that is the battle for good governance, integrity, true democracy, and market economics. The US, yeah, there is a degree of disruption to the democracy in the United States. This is not unique, actually, just to the current administration. You could see it developing really probably since the Clinton administration, where the center of both the Republican and the Democratic parties has been hollowed out a bit. Therefore, compromise is more difficult. Because of our primary process that you have to win the nomination for your party before you can run for the presidency or Senate or House of Representatives, you have to win your party's nomination. That in those elections, if you will, the party primaries, the people who vote overwhelmingly are the activists. So you get pulled, if you're a Democrat, your worry is actually being outflanked on the left, and you're pulled to the left. We saw this with Hillary Clinton on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've seen it with other candidates. And if you're a Republican, you get pulled further to the right by the primary, and then you race back to the center. The problem is that, again, the center has hollowed out, especially in the House of Representatives. And this is something the U.S. is going to have to come to grips with. Do we continue to have party primaries? Do we allow redrawing of district boundaries in ways that are bizarre, but preserve them as Republican or Democrat? Both parties do it. And certainly the concerns that are now manifest in the House of Representatives, as announced by the Speaker, to pursue impeachment proceedings. These are certainly legitimate concerns, I think. And I think individuals of both parties have voiced those concerns, and then we'll see where this does indeed take us.
You're, of course, a former director of the CIA. It seems that the whistleblower on this particular call was a CIA officer. President Trump is naming and calling this a coup to get rid of a president. Do you think?
I would rather see this, honestly, as checks and balances, protections, again, whistleblower laws. All of this, I think, is working out. Look, your own country has a bit of a vibrant democracy, we might term it. I mean, it's occasionally loud and noisy, and cacophonous is sometimes the word used. As long as it's engaged, as long as when the dust settles, folks can come back together, I think that then that can be occasionally healthy. Obviously, the United States has been through a lot of disruption in our past history. We have seen, let's not forget, this is a country that started out in its early years with the sitting Vice President of the United States shooting and killing the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, in a duel. Now, I don't want to see a return to that. That should not be the new normal.
No, let's hope not.
But we had a civil war. Again, I don't want to see that. We had the Roosevelt era, the Teddy Roosevelt era of, the trust busting and so forth. And so again, this is a difficult period. What I might do, though, is come back to why it is perhaps even more important that we get through this quickly, not just in the United States, but in other freedom-loving democratic countries around the world. And that is because we are challenged by an alternative system. again, that system has produced results in 40 years that no country has ever remotely produced, and you must admire and respect that. But there is a challenge between different systems. History is back. It turns out that history didn't actually end when Francis Fukuyama wrote his article in '89 that predicted that the Soviet Communist Party and command economy was going to collapse of its own weight in the face of the US-led Western world democratically elected governments and market economics. Now there's a different contender, a different competition. We should have a competition. We also need to have cooperation, because let's keep in mind that unlike the Cold War, in this case, what is perhaps developing and hopefully will not become a Cold War is with a country who is the biggest trading partner for the US prior to the tariffs and for many of our allies and partners around the world. So we do need to get our act together, if you will, in democratic countries. We do need to deal with the legitimate issues that are manifest in the populism that we see, concerns about a variety of different inequalities and how to deal with refugees and again, how to make sure the economy works for all. All of this, the rule of law, anti-corruption, integrity in government and so forth, all of this does need to be addressed by democratic countries, and my own country indeed, I think, shares that responsibility.
Indeed, I think that, I mean, clearly those impeachment calls on the part of the Democratic Party will dominate the headlines for a long time to come. Are you concerned about the implications for the ability for the US to lead? Because it will be distracted by domestic politics for some time to come.
Again, I would come back to the great Ben Hodges and say again, don't just be distracted by what is sucking the oxygen out of the room in CNN or Fox or MSNBC to have the different sides. Follow the troops, follow the money, follow the policy. And I think that by and large, if you do that, you will see that there is more continuity than there is change, even though there is, in some cases, legitimate questioning about why we're contributing as much as we are if others are not meeting the stated objective of NATO countries. If sometimes trade agreements have some negative consequences as well as broadly positive consequences. We have to come to grips with all of these issues, and we need to do it, I would hope to do it, in dialogue that is respectful, that is constructive, and again, that is ultimately mutually beneficial for all who are involved. And I say that, again, as someone who literally spent his life starting as a second lieutenant in the Allied Command Europe Mobile Force as a young paratroop lieutenant, all the way through 4 stars in often NATO assignments, and understanding the value of alliances, understanding the value of friends around the world, which is why, again, it is such a privilege for me to be back here in Poland, a country that, as I explained up front, is very, very special to me and to many of my fellow Americans.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it. Don't get distracted. Keep your eye on the ball. I think I speak for all when I say we could have continued this conversation easily for a long time to come. So many more topics that could have been covered, but alas, for the time being, I thank you for imparting knowledge on us and your judgment on the current issues dominating headlines all around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, General David Petraeus.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, General.